Warm greetings to everyone. On behalf of the PAASE President, Dr. Gisela P. Concepcion, I would like to welcome you all to this online parallel session 8.2 with a theme on environment and atmosphere via Zoom platform. We are also live at http streaming.uplb.edu.ph. This parallel session is actually part of the 2020 annual scientific meeting of the Philippine-American Academy of Science and Engineering, otherwise known as PAASE, which is also celebrating its 40th anniversary. My name is Juan Pulhin. I'm a professor at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and I will be your host for this session. My colleague will be assisting me as co-host of the question and answer session in the person of Dr. Dixon Tihebanya, a multi-awarded outstanding young scientist, also of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. We are honored and indeed privileged to have 6 very distinguished speakers in this session located in 4 different parts of the world, 4 countries to be specific. 2 from the United States of America, 1 each from Malaysia and Japan, and 2 from the Philippines. They will be sharing with us cutting-edge researches and pioneering institutional initiatives in the field of environmental and atmospheric sciences. As flashed on the screen, we have divided the presentation into 2 major parts. The first part includes a 30-minute keynote paper to be followed by 2 other presentations covering recent advances in atmospheric sciences. This will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. The second part will also involve 3 papers that focus on broader issues on the environment, including long-term monitoring, science communication, and capacity development. This will also be followed by a Q&A session. Before we proceed to the presentation, let me give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Dixon Tihebanya, to explain to us a bit about the Q&A guidelines. Dixon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Pulhin. So just briefly, now we'll go over with the Q&A guidelines. Number 1, please address your question to a specific presenter by typing them in the Q&A window. If you're following the Zoom, there is a Q&A button there. Just click it and just post your question there. The Secretariat will be collating these questions. Selected questions will be shown on the screen, which will then be read by the host and addressed to a specific presenter. If time will allow, we will entertain live questions through the raise hand button. Please wait for your name to be called in case you raise your hand. And lastly, in case your questions will not be answered during the session time due to time constraint, the Secretariat will take note of your questions and send them through email to the presenters after the parallel session. You will then be contacted by the Secretariat regarding the presenter's response to your question. So looking forward to a productive Q&A session with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hibanya, for the Q&A guidelines. Now let's proceed to the part one of the presentations, dealing particularly on atmospheric sciences. Our keynote presenter is a very much distinguished scientist, a senior scientist emeritus of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, of the United States of America. He is a former senior physical scientist at the Earth Sciences Division of NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center, a former chief scientist in NASA aircraft missions in the Arctic and the Antarctic. He is also a recipient of several NASA awards, including the NASA Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal, and a coordinating lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the 2014 Fifth Assessment Report of Working Group 1 contribution to IPCC on a report titled Climate Change 2013, the Physical Science Basis. And if I may add, I was looking at his Google Scholar H index, and probably he has one of the highest H index with an 81 H index, probably one of the highest that a Filipino scientist has ever achieved. So he's really a well-cited author. So it is indeed our pleasure and a great privilege to have our keynote presenter in the person of Dr. Josefino C. Comiso to discuss his topic entitled Anthropogenic CO2, Sources and Impacts on the Environment and Climate. Dr. Comiso, the floor is yours.
Greetings to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank John and the PAASE organizers for inviting me to participate in this session. And thanks for the kind introduction. As one of two seminar speakers a few years ago, the other speaker, who was much younger than me, was introduced as a rising scientist. And I was then introduced as a declining scientist. So I'm glad that I was not introduced the same way today. But I must say that I am still active. I keep my office at NASA as emeritus, and have continued to publish. And I'm sure that many of my colleagues who are retired can do the same. As indicated by John, my H index actually increased from 67 to 81 just after I retired, and mainly because of papers that I published after retirement. So I'd like to start by looking at showing you some statistics. So the number of babies born worldwide every minute is 250, according to statistics. The number of deaths is 107. So the net increase in population is 143 per minute. And if you do the math, the net population increase is actually around 750 million per decade. Now the population is about 7 billion. So with this increase in population per decade, it's gonna be not long before it can get to be 8 billion. So it's a lot of humans to satisfy. And just to meet the energy needs of this population, there's a need for around 36 billion metric tons of energy in terms of carbon dioxide that is then emitted to the atmosphere. And this is an equivalent to an increase of about 2.5 parts per meter per year. Also, we have been losing about 12 million hectares of tropical forests every year, 4 million of which are primary forests because of the needs of this many population. So just to illustrate visually where the populations are located, this is a nighttime image of the globe, and you can see where activities are going on. In the US, it's mainly in the East Coast and part of California, then Mexico as well. And then in Europe, it's mainly England, France, Spain, and Germany. And then you have the Middle East, India, China, Japan, Korea, and a little bit of light from the Philippines. And I think that's Manila. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, for a long time, the population was a mere 250,000 people globally. And it was not until the year 1500 that it reached something like 1 billion people in population. And at the beginning of the standard revolution, when there was also big advances in medical science, then we have this exponential growth that get us into around 7 billion people now. So in 1886, Bante Arrhenius looked at the problem of emission of CO2. And he was then observing increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. And he studied this for 2 years and came up with a conclusion that if we double the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, it would cause an increase in temperature by as much as 4 to 5 degrees. So based on data at that time, he speculated that it would take about 3,000 years for doubling to occur. So in the process, nobody really paid attention to this. And it was only when Charles Keeling started making measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa, Hawaii, that people realized that doubling can occur in a much shorter time. The graph on the right is a manifestation of that. And with a continuation of the plot, then you get a doubling within the century. So at the same time, the surface temperature has been increasing, as shown in the plot at the bottom. And if you look at the plot at the left, there's actually a good agreement or correlation of the increase in CO2 with the increase in temperature, global temperature. So why do we worry about greenhouse gases and CO2 in particular? CO2 is one of the molecules in the atmosphere that has 3 or more atoms. And you need 3 or more atoms in order to meet the required vibrational motion of the molecule. The possibilities for the motion are shown on the right. And the only components in the atmosphere that has 3 or more atoms are CO2, methane, nitrate, and ozone, as well as water vapor, which is actually more abundant than the other 4. But majority of the gas in the atmosphere are actually other types of gases like nitrogen is 78% of the atmosphere, oxygen is 21%, and argon is about 1%. So what issue here is something that everybody is familiar with. We get greenhouse gases as a result of deforestation, CFCs, transportation vehicles, factories, and sources of energy that then burn coal and other fossil fuels. So when the data first came out, it was just a point measurement from Mauna Loa, Hawaii. And it has been an issue where all these carbon dioxides are coming from. And this was made possible only recently with the launch of OCO2 satellite on board the ATRAN, which also has the Aqua satellite with an Earth sensor. And the Earth sensor is actually able to get the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, but on a more general basis. So it's only the advent of OCO2 and also a Japanese sensor called GOSAT that we finally are able to pinpoint the location of sources of carbon dioxide. And this is what they call XCO2, because XCO2 is actually the average over a column of carbon dioxide in a certain location. So, for example, if you look at XCO2 in Asia, the ones on the right are the ones with a lot of increases, what we call anomaly in carbon dioxide. And that includes Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities in China. And you can see that South Korea has a lot of contributions as well as Japan. And it's probably Taiwan, and the Philippines is over here. So a more complete analysis was published by Haka Rainen in 2016. And what you see on the top are actually XCO2 in the US. And as you see, much of the sources are in the eastern region. Then you have in Europe and Middle East, as well as Africa. And this is in Asia, and that's where China is, in India, New Delhi over there. And the Philippines, there's not much over there. It also turned out that the CO2 is also correlated with nitrate, and this is results from OMI, of nitrate columns. And you can see that where it's high, it's also, the CO2 is also high, and especially in China. And this is emission from CO2 in 2014. It's not as much as what you see on the top, but then you can see that this is just from 1 year data. So quantitatively, if you look at contributions from the different countries, advanced countries and middle advanced, you can see that the US was contributing the most, but if you look at the curve, it has basically flattened out, and there's not much increase over the years. And in Europe, it's actually declining. Russia is also declining, but there are cases like in India where it's increasing. But the most obvious change is China, where it was number 3 here and started to climb up, and now it's way above the contributions from other countries. So as introduced, I participated in the IPCC report, where I learned a lot about what's going on in terms of the physical basis of climate change. Actually, this was the plenary session where we depended the report after it was written. We have the coordinating authors participating, but all governments of the world were involved as well. And took quite a time before everything was approved, but much of the delay was caused by the fact that there were political statements like the Japan Sea was not considered by the Koreans as Japan Sea. They wanted to be called the East Sea, so it's mainly political. So this was the cover of the book, and the main results are shown on the right. The fact that the globe, there's global warming going on, as indicated on the right, it's an anomaly map. And the sources of warming can be pinned down to the other parameters below. One can be changing contribution from the sun. Every now and then we get sunspots, and the orbital parameter of the Earth changes with time as well. But this is a direct measurement of contribution from the sun, and you don't see anything much in terms of changes at the time when temperature was changing. The other one is volcanic eruption. So for this to be consistent with the trend in temperature, you'd have to have a lot more volcanic eruption on the left and hardly any on the right. But what you see here in 1992 is the effect of Pinatubo, where you normally have a cooling for about 1 or 2 years. And in terms of interannual variability, these are contributions by various phenomena like El Nino, or the Arctic oscillation, or Pacific decadal oscillation. And what you see here is basically a new trend as well. So the only one with a trend that's comparable to that of surface temperature is the anthropogenic component, which is mainly driven by greenhouse gases. So we did some sensitivity analysis using models. So what happens if we keep the carbon dioxide the same as it is now and we don't allow it to increase? And that's called RCP 2.6. In between is 4.5 and 6. And the last one is 8.5, which is keeping the carbon dioxide to increase as on the present time, the same rate as at present. And it will lead to 936 parts per million at the end of the century. And the net result are shown on the right. With temperature, the temperature will go up by as much as 45 degrees. Otherwise, if we do something about CO2 and keep it from increasing, then at a certain point in the near future, it will flatten out and there's no increase in temperature and the world will be more livable. There's also a problem in the Arctic in the fact that we have observed a large decline in the Arctic ice during the summer. And that suggests that we will lose the ice altogether during the summer. And if we abide by RCP 2.6, we could still save that because in the mid-century, the decline will flatten out and it doesn't decline anymore. Otherwise, sometime in the middle of the century, we'll lose the ice cover. And there's this issue about ocean acidification, which I'll also discuss later. If we abide by RCP 2.6, then the pH is not gonna increase anymore, much more than where we are now. Otherwise, we'll start to drop by more and more until we have an ocean that is improving. So basically, the changes are shown on the right with RCP 2.6. We don't have much change in temperature, not much change in precipitation, not much change in the ice cover, and not much change in acidity. Otherwise, there are tremendous changes in temperature, precipitation, and ice, as well as acidity in the ocean. So the impact, and actually we are observing it now, is the fact that we have a warming planet. And the warming is actually not even spatially. In fact, it's concentrated in the polar regions. And as you see now, it's the rate of warming is highest in the Arctic region. And in fact, we read a paper recently that indicates that the warming is 3 times higher in the Arctic than the global warming. So the biggest manifestation or indicator of that warming is actually seen in the Arctic basin. The Arctic basin is covered by sea ice, and it used to be that much of the Arctic basin is covered by ice at the end of the summer, as shown over here. But in recent years, you can see that it's practically much less ice than before, and that has been sustained in the last few years. So that's represented in this graph. A large decline, something like 10 to 14% per decade. So as indicated earlier, if this continues on, we'll lose the ice cover in the Arctic by the end of, by the middle of the century. And this whole area will become blue water for the first time. And it has been observed that ice in the Arctic has always been there, as observed in the last 1,500 years. So a problem with the decline of ice in the Arctic is the fact that the Arctic then becomes a lot warmer because the ocean absorbs a lot of energy from the sun and becomes warmer, and ice is a lot colder than the ocean. And the problem is that the surrounding areas are also cryospheric areas, like that's also the site of a lot of glaciers, snow cover, permafrost, and most importantly, the Greenland ice sheet. So this is the Greenland ice sheet, and the reason why we are concerned about it is because the sea level equivalence of the Greenland ice sheet is about 7 meters. So if you just increase the sea level by 6 meters, you affect about 300 million people worldwide. And there's recently been a publication indicating that the ice sheet is in peril, published in Nature. But our own analysis indicates that there's even another problem that might accelerate the demise of the ice sheet. The fact that although the elevation of the ice sheet is very high, about 3 or more kilometers from sea level, and it's very cold throughout the year, the area that gets melted on the surface is very little at the beginning. What you see is the orange that gets melted. This is already 2000, so early on, the orange would be a lot smaller in area. So this is, the white is the only area where it doesn't get melted. But it has been the case that for some years after that, like in 2002, almost the whole area got melted on the surface. And in 2012, it was even worse. So there's a declining area in Greenland that doesn't get melted in the summer. And the reason why we worry about that is when the surface gets melted, it produces liquid water that you see here that then percolates to the bottom. And the water then gets into the bottom of the ice sheet, and it can serve as a lubricant that makes the ice sheet dynamic. So if the ice sheet moves a lot, then it becomes unstable, and you may get a lot more chunks from the ice sheet being deposited to the Atlantic Ocean. The same is true with the Antarctic. Actually, Antarctica has a sea level equivalence of 65 meters. But it's divided into East Antarctica, which is extremely cold, and West Antarctica. Now, East Antarctica is basically safe because it's really the coldest area on Earth. It can go as cold as minus 80 degrees centigrade during the winter. But West Antarctica is vulnerable because in the summer, the temperature is only about 5 degrees centigrade. So a slight increase in temperature will get the area melted. On top of that, the ice sheet in West Antarctica is sitting on the bedrock that is below sea level. So that makes it even more vulnerable. So we worry about sea level rise, and we have satellite instruments that now monitor the sea level continuously. And over the period of since 1993, we have looked at the data, And the results are represented here in terms of sea level rise. And you can see that especially there's a lot of variability. For example, in San Francisco, there's actually not much in terms of sea level rise. And you can see that the red, which is the global average, is very similar to that in San Francisco. That's the case of Carlos Tetan. In Stockholm is even the opposite. But in Manila, if you look at this, that's the average, and the slope for Manila is much higher. So in fact, for Manila, the rate of sea level rise is about 3 times global average. So there's been some questions asked, why the spatial distribution of sea level rise is so varied. And some people, they were thinking about internal variability as caused by El Nino or other observatory phenomenon. But a study was made recently at JPL trying to look at the data and do modeling studies, trying to remove the effect of natural phenomena variability. And this is with the original data, which is very similar to what I showed earlier. And this one is with the variability removed. And you can see that if at all, the rate of sea level rise near the Philippines is even higher. So that's a cause for concern. So I live in Maryland, and just about 2 hours away, there's this Chesapeake Bay where there's an island. There used to be 4 houses in that island. And as of 2016, there's only 1 house left, and it looks like this. So that is what can happen in islands all over the world. And recently, I just went to the 100 islands. So most of those islands would be underneath the surface with sea level rise. And in fact, the Philippines is actually vulnerable because it's number 10 in the world with the largest population near the coastal regions. And 20% of this population is in the coastal zone as well. So one problem is flooding. As a result of warming, we have been getting more and more extreme floods. And some of you may remember Ondol. And this flood is an indication that there are increases in flooding frequency, especially for extreme flooding. Another is drought. As you see here, there are times when the area of drought is actually extreme. And one example was in California, where they had drought for several years, 2011 to 2016. That actually killed about 102 million trees. And there was a lot of problems with agricultural products, since California is one of the food baskets of the world. And locally in Cotabato, we had a drought in 2015. So this is an example of the drought over rice crops and corn crops. And actually, a lot of people suffered. Around 25,000 had to be rationed because of the drought in Cotabato. So far, it's another problem. If you have drought, then it can be followed by extensive fire. This is what happened in California from satellite. This is as observed from the ground in Indonesia. And the Indonesian fire was actually large scale. It destroyed 850,000 hectares of forest. And $2 billion in property in 2019. And to think that the previous year, in 2018, about more than 500,000 hectares of forest was also destroyed. So this is very damaging to the environment, and the trend is shown in this plot here. So another effect of warming is actually the occurrences of heat waves. And we had the big heat waves in Russia in 2010. Drought happened all over Russia. There was ranging fire all over. In fact, they recorded 558 fires covering 180,000 hectares. And the temperature soared up to 42 degrees centigrade, causing 56,000 to die. There were similar events in Europe that killed 35,000 people, and one in Chicago that killed 900 people. So one of the big things that is not associated with climate change, but is a direct effect of increasing carbon dioxide, is ocean acidification. So this is the increase in atmospheric CO2. The biggest sequestration is occurring in the ocean. So the PCO2 in the ocean has been increasing as well. And in the process, the pH of the ocean has been declining, making it more and more acidic. And this is a problem because the ocean can only sequester so much carbon dioxide. The other that's not absorbed directly reacts with carbonate into other molecules. And carbonate is very important in terms of the shell formation and skeletons. So it affects clams, crabs, oysters, orcas, and other planktons. So it can lead to a dead spots in the ocean, and it can severely impact the fisheries industry. So the distribution of warming as it is now, ocean acidification as it is now is shown over here, and it's actually concentrated near the polar region, where fisheries is actually very productive. So it can greatly impact fisheries. But there's some good news, the fact that people tend to get more and more into alternative energy, like solar power. It used to cost a lot per watt, more than 900, and it has been reduced to almost zero. At the same time, since 2005, there's an exponential increase in the use of solar panels. So globally, we're getting a lot more power from solar cells than ever before. And even wind technology has gone into much more abundant use as well. This is the wind turbine in Bengi, Ilocos Norte. We are the first to establish such a facility in Southeast Asia, but now it's being adopted throughout Southeast Asia. And globally, the wind power has increased from 6.1 gigabyte, which we thought is almost practically negligible, but now it has increased to 490 gigawatt in 2016. So now it must be even a lot more. So to summarize, CO2 has been increasing more rapidly than anticipated. Key sources have been identified, making mitigation more focused and perhaps more easy to implement. So we know that excessive CO2 can cause a lot of problems, causing extreme events and ocean acidification. And mitigation strategies are needed, but it's probably a lot easier because we can identify where they are. And we need good environmental policies to alleviate problems with flooding, drought, fire, and other environmental problems. So John asked me if there's anything about COVID that could help the environment. What I've seen is that the global CO2 was reduced by 5.5% in the first half of 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. Pollution in China was reduced by 25%. Aerosol optical depth in India, where you will never see the sky sometimes, is reduced from 0.68 in early March to 0.15 in April. So there are lots of advantages in reducing CO2, and I don't favor continuation of the lockdown, but at least this indicates that there is an anthropogenic solution to this anthropogenic problem. So, salamat, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Comiso, for that very comprehensive and interesting run-through on the state of knowledge on climate change, particularly highlighting the anthropogenic role on climate change and its impacts on both human and the natural systems. I think in relation to the question on the COVID-19, our next speaker would be able to talk more about that. But before I call him, let me just inform our participants that we will entertain the question and answer after the two other presentations. And we have also noted those of you who have raised their hand. So although it does not prevent Dr. Comiso to chat you online using the Q&A windows. So let's move on. Our next presenter is a professor of atmospheric chemistry and air pollution of the Department of Earth Sciences and Environment, the Faculty of Science and Technology of the University of Kebangsaan, Malaysia. He is a fellow of the Malaysian Academy of Science. At the same time, a concurrent deputy dean at the postgraduate level at the Faculty of Science and Technology, also of UKM, from 2018 to the present, and has been a recipient of the Top Research Scientist Malaysian Award of the Academy of Science Malaysia in the year 2018.